Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 372. Elijah is coming to the Passover Seder. But who is he? Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today, like many of you, we are looking forward to Passover, which is starting in just a few days. And we started thinking about elements of Passover that we haven't talked about that much yet on Judaism Unbound, and one of those relates to a book that just won a major Jewish book award, and it's about Elijah. He is a character who is involved with the Seder, but I think a lot of us are used to maybe opening the door for him, but we don't know much about what he's all about and why he's coming to the Seder. So that's a conversation that we're going to have today with our guest, who's actually a returning guest, Daniel Matt. He is the author of a relatively new book, which is called Becoming Elijah, Prophet of Transformation. Now, I've said that Daniel Matt is a returning guest. He was actually our guest in episode 161, which was almost exactly 4 years ago. And also, when I reviewed the introduction from that previous episode, I realized that we were interviewing Daniel Matt about his translation of the Zohar, the major book of Jewish mysticism. But we also were excited about a new project that he was just launching 4 years ago, which he continues to do, where he is teaching classes on the Zohar in these kind of 6-week chunks. And I remember 4 years ago being really inspired by the idea of doing Jewish learning that way. It is a lot like our Yeshiva program, and it is occurring to me, I don't think it's completely linear, but it does not surprise me that 2 years later, we created a whole online learning platform that runs in quite a similar way to the way that Daniel Matt's Zohar class runs. While we're talking about the Yeshiva, I'll just mention that we are now launching registration for our next series of classes, which are going to begin right after the week of Passover ends. So check it out at judaismunbound.com/classes. Now let's turn our attention to our conversation with Daniel Matt. Again, he is the author of the recent book called Becoming Elijah, Prophet of Transformation, which was recently awarded the inaugural Rabbi Sacks Book Prize by Yeshiva University. That prize, of course, honors Jonathan Sacks, who was the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom and recently passed away. Daniel Matt is a scholar and teacher of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, and as we talked about in our previous episode, he completed an 18-year project translating the Zohar, the central work of Kabbalah. That is found in a 9-volume annotated work called the Zohar Pritzker Edition, published by Stanford University Press. Daniel Matt, for 20 years, served as a professor at the Center for Jewish Studies within the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, and he has also taught at Stanford University and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. In addition to this book, Daniel Matt's books include God and the Big Bang, Discovering Harmony Between Science and Spirituality, and The Essential Kabbalah, The Heart of Jewish Mysticism. So let's dive in and learn more about this character, Elijah the Prophet. Daniel Matt, welcome back to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you on again.
Good to be here with you.
Well, I wanted to start with the Elijah that we know, that most of us know, which is that, or maybe we don't quite know him, we know that we do something for him, which is at the Passover Seder. A lot of us have had the experience where we go and we open the door for Elijah. We've got a cup of wine for him. Sometimes the wine disappears. Maybe he came and drank it. Maybe the parents did something with it. But that's kind of what we know, but we don't ever see him. And so I guess
Speak
that
for
there's
yourself.
an element. Most of us haven't seen him. And so I guess there's a question of just, could you talk a little bit about why Elijah has a role at the Passover Seder, why this biblical figure is somehow coming to the Passover Seder, and how did that kind of get imagined in the first place?
Yeah, sure. If people have heard of Elijah, and most Jews have heard of Elijah, and many Christians and Muslims, but very few people know about Elijah in the Bible. Some people don't know that he's even in the Bible. People who know Elijah know of him because of what you said, because he seems to appear at the Seder. So what's interesting about Elijah is that he's so familiar, but he's so mysterious. And even the Seder, I mean, why is he at the Seder? Everybody knows that he's part of the Seder, but why that specific time, that event? Probably because Passover celebrates redemption, the redemption from slavery in Egypt. And the Passover is seen as the time when the Messiah will come. And so Elijah, according to the Bible, is going to announce the day of the Lord. And the rabbis took that to mean he's going to herald the Messiah. So if Elijah is going to herald the Messiah, it makes sense for him to come on Pesach, on Passover, when we expect that final redemption. But, you don't find anywhere in the Talmud, nowhere in rabbinic literature is Elijah associated with Passover, with the Seder. And it's really the kind of thing that's a custom. We don't know when it began. And after it was a custom, the rabbis try to explain it. So you have explanations after the fact, really. So opening the door for Elijah. Now, actually, there was a custom to open the door on Passover Eve that had nothing to do with Elijah. Beginning of the Seder, we say, Kol dichfin yeteh v'yechul. Let all who are hungry come and eat. So some people would leave the door open, not for Elijah, just for a stranger. But at a certain point, this was associated with Eliyahu. The cup, why do we have a cup of Elijah on the Seder table? That too, not mentioned anywhere in the Bible or the Talmud or the Midrash. It's a late custom. It seems to be an Ashkenazic custom. And here's what Rabbi says about it. This is someone writing in the 15th century. He says, I've seen some people on the night of Passover who pour a special cup and place it on the table, saying that this is the cup for Elijah the prophet. And I don't know the reason. Okay, here's a rabbi in the 15th century. He sees the custom. He doesn't know why people are doing it. But it seems that the reason derives from this. If Elijah the prophet comes on the night of Passover, he too will need a cup. For even a poor person among Israel must drink no less than 4 cups. And if the cup isn't ready, we'd have to prepare it for him, which might delay the Seder. I mean, what's worse than delaying the Seder? It's long enough as it is. So here's a rabbi who says, maybe that's the reason. Now look at this. This is a Sephardic rabbi writing the 17th century. You might think that's a long time ago, but Jewish history, that's yesterday. The 17th century, it's still not a widespread custom. So this Sephardic rabbi says, it seems this is the custom I saw among a few Ashkenazim, Jews living in Western Europe, to leave on the table 1 empty cup in which to pour all the wine left over after they've drunk at least the required minimum from their cups. Right? Everybody has to drink a certain amount, but you don't have to drain the whole cup. So people according to this custom, would pour the remainder of each of the 4 cups into this one large cup. This cup is called the cup of Elijah the prophet. This custom pleased me, and I follow it. From the remains of those cups poured into this cup, I drink during the meal. So this rabbi, he drinks the cup himself. It's called the cup of Elijah, but not really for him. So this is a gradual custom. But the last passage I want to read about this is from the great Talmudic authority, named Elijah, the Gaon of Vilna. He says, we have the custom of pouring a 5th cup and calling it the cup of Elijah the prophet. The reason is that there's a dispute in the Talmud over whether one needs a 5th cup. Right, we drink 4 cups of wine, but actually there's an argument in the Talmud, should it be 4 or 5? But the Gaon of Vilna says, when Elijah comes, the doubt will be clarified. Because that's one of his roles. We'll see later, Elijah is going to solve all halachic disputes. So he's also going to solve this dispute. Should we drink 4 or 5 cups? Therefore, based on this doubt, the cup is poured but not drunk, and it's called the cup of Elijah. So he says that's why it's a cup of Elijah. It's not that he's going to drink it, it's that he's going to come and tell us, should we drink it? Should we drink 4 cups or 5 cups? So gradually it became, as we all know, you have a cup on the table for him, and it's a mystery. It's one of those things to get the children asking questions or to keep them up, and that's some of the background.
Amazing. So you gave me a couple ideas for some innovations to Seder. One is that it sounds like we should have 4 cups for Elijah, because if he has to meet his minimum, we actually should have 4 out and not 1. And then you said there's arguments about 4 or 5. So maybe just to be safe, we should actually have 5 cups just for Elijah in addition to all of our cups. That's number one. Second thing is I thought that it was very deep when you said quickly that, there's certain people who drink themselves from the cup of Elijah. You close your book by talking about how there's this idea that like a little bit of Elijah is in all of us. So maybe it's all of our responsibility and license to ourselves drink his cup because we actually are a little bit of a reincarnation of Elijah ourselves. Okay, now to my actual question. I saw that this book existed and I was very excited. I want to say why I was excited, and then the spoiler is I want to hear like why you wrote it. But why I was excited to read it is that it's in a biography series. That's interesting. This is a figure, Elijah, who does not in any kind of historical sense have a birth date and a death date. Most people in this series from Yale University Press are actual human figures with a birth date and a death date at some point in history. Elijah isn't. But the fact that it's in this series, it pointed to me like, oh, you're going to be telling an ongoing story of the various stages, the various evolutions of Elijah over time. This is not going to be a book that looks at, oh, here are the however many references of Elijah in the Bible. Or on the other hand, here are the list of references of Elijah in the Talmud. Or we could have books like that, and I'm sure there are, and they're interesting. But this is different because it's looking at sort of the way Elijah has ebbed and flowed and changed as an idea, as a person in Jewish history over time. So that really excited me. But my question to you is that part of what excited you? Or why did you, as a scholar of mysticism, as somebody who has written books on many different subjects and translated various works, like, why were you excited to write this book about Elijah?
Yeah, well, first of all, you're right. This is in a series called Jewish Lives. And, does Elijah really fit there? I had to convince Yale University Press that this is part of the series. And I made the case that this is really the most appropriate person to include. Why? Because the series is called Jewish Lives in the plural. And Elijah is the only one who has multiple lives. There's something multiple about him. He has kind of multiple personalities. And the most fascinating thing is what you alluded to, that he changes over time. Each generation seems to reimagine Elijah. So what you see is not only how Elijah grows, but what was important to Jews in various eons, various centuries, what mattered to them. So that's part of the fascination. But I'll tell you, I really had a problematical relationship with Elijah growing up because I'm a rabbi's son. And, you really can't avoid running into Elijah if you're at all traditional. Very traditional Jews actually invoke his name 3 times a day in the Birkat HaMazon, in the grace after meals. But for me, Elijah was always there. I mean, every Saturday night we would sing songs about Elijah or to Elijah as part of the Havdalah, part of the conclusion of Shabbat. And, Shabbat can take a long time to end. And if you're observing Shabbat and you're a young kid, you're a teenager, it's Saturday night, it's 7:30, 8 o'clock, 8:30, you're wondering, is this ever going to end? And then to sing one more song. So Elijah is kind of prolonging the Sabbath. So I think I may have had some resentment to that. But then it was also the question of, is he real? We're talking about this person, we're mentioning him, but okay, he lived in the 9th century BCE. He must have died then. Why are we still talking about this fellow? So in a way, I wanted to write the book to redeem him for myself. And it's funny, I mentioned it to a few people I very highly respect. One of them just kind of smirked, like, why are you spending time writing about Eliyahu Hanavi? Aren't there more important things to do? And another person said to me, the book must have a humorous slant, right? And I realized something very important, that Elijah is so prominent. You run into him so frequently that either you have to believe entirely that Eliyahu Hanavi is really there, or you have to dismiss him, or you just have to tell jokes about him. For many Jews, their attitude toward Elijah is somehow, is humorous. How can we take this seriously? So when I heard that, I realized, I really wanted to redeem him for myself. Something you also mentioned, that you finally find in Hasidism, that late revivalist movement, that kind of popularization of the Kabbalah, Hasidism sees each of us as having what they call Bechinat Eliyahu, an aspect of Elijah, a quality of Elijah. So he's not just some mythical figure, some legendary figure out there. He's the possibility within yourself for what? For enlightenment, for discovery, for passion. In fact, that's really why I call the book Becoming Elijah. What that means on the one hand is how did he become who he became? How did he change from that biblical zealot to the compassionate superhero? But at the very end of the book, what I suggest is that each of us can become Elijah in a certain sense by fanning that spark into a flame, by finding that passionate quality to which we give the name Eliyahu.
So I wanted to start I think we're going to spend most of our time today on those later versions of Elijah, but I thought it could be interesting. I mean, it's interesting for me to start with that biblical character and understand what is his starting point. And I'll tell you that the part that struck me the most, I think it's because you repeat it a few times in the book, so I bet it struck you as well, is the description of Elijah that we have in the Book of Kings as a hairy man wearing a loincloth. Because the images that I think I've had of Elijah up till now are either some version of Santa Claus, because we have him in the Seder, we open the door, he comes in, he drinks some wine, so he's jolly. I mean, maybe he's wearing something more Middle Eastern than a red outfit with a hat, but somehow he's kind of like a benevolent figure. And also maybe this idea, this more mystical someone, and maybe you could imagine a mystical person like the Dalai Lama wearing something that's a little bit less formal than we might imagine, but somehow a hairy man with a loincloth is not how I ever thought of Elijah. And there's this vision of Elijah in the Bible that he is kind of a zealot, like you said, an extremist. But when I imagine that person running around essentially naked doing that, it brings up a very different image. And it made me wonder, well, why did this person, you could see why they captured the imagination of people, but it's weird then that it captured the imagination of people and then went in the direction that it went in, as opposed to a direction of, yeah, this was our quasi-madman sort of person in our history, and we have some of those, but that's not where he ended up.
Yeah, Elijah changes so much. I mean, really, you could write an entire book just about Elijah in the Bible. There are only, I think, 7 chapters. So you could say only, or there are 7 chapters in the book of Kings about Eliyahu. He is something of a wild man. And I think the rabbis kind of tame him in a way. You could say he becomes domesticated. He's such a loner. He's really off on his own. We hear nothing about a wife or children. We hear nothing at all about his whole maturation. It's just he pops up on the scene out of nowhere and he's confronting King Ahab, the king of Israel. And basically, he's always confronting people. He doesn't meet with people, he confronts them. And he's almost too much for the rabbis to take. Just in the Bible himself, the quality he really manifests more than anything else is zealotry, right? He's the zealot. And it's interesting, the Hebrew word for zealous is actually the same word that means jealous. Right? In English, they're very close, zealous and jealous. In Hebrew, it's one word, kin'ah. So Elijah is a zealot, but in what sense is he jealous? He's jealous on behalf of God. He's not jealous of God. He's jealous for God. In which he thinks the Israelites have betrayed God. They've gone off to worship the false gods, Baal and Asherah, right? The male and female god and goddess of the Canaanites. So the people kind of want to hedge their bets. The Israelites, they're willing to accept Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, they're willing to accept the Lord, but they also want to worship Baal, the storm god, just in case. And Elijah insisted that they make a choice. So Elijah is an extremist. Elijah can't fathom how anyone could worship anyone but the true Lord. So he's a fierce zealot. He has this great dramatic contest. He has 450 prophets of Baal versus Elijah. And the people show up because everybody likes a contest. And Elijah says, okay, let's see who can bring down fire from heaven. And Elijah says, you go first, try to bring down fire from heaven. The prophets of Baal chant and shout all morning. Finally, Elijah says, well, maybe shout a little louder. Maybe Baal is sleeping. Maybe he's off on a journey. Maybe he's going to relieve himself, taking a leak. Maybe you should, shout a little louder. So the prophets start gashing themselves and going into frenzy, but they don't bring down any fire. Then Elijah recites a simple prayer, and fire comes down from heaven. So he defeats the enemy. He defeats the prophets of Baal. He's won the hearts of Israel back to the true Lord. And what happens? Does he then convert the prophets of Baal to monotheism? No, maybe the later Elijah would do that, maybe the Messianic Elijah, but the biblical Eliyahu, what does he do? He slaughters all 450 prophets of Baal. Maybe it means he had them slaughtered, but the Hebrew says he slaughtered them. So that's the biblical Elijah. He's so fierce, and he's not just fierce against the enemies of God, he's fierce against the Israelites. And the rabbis criticize him for that. The rabbis think that he's gone too far. And really, the biblical account, too, you could see as being critical. You might say that Elijah is the only prophet who was ever fired. God actually fires Elijah. The other great scene, one scene is that confrontation on Mount Carmel, but the other great dramatic scene is when Elijah has a revelation of God at Mount Sinai, right? Which, of course, reminds us of Moses. You could say the portrait of Elijah in the Bible is in some way modeled on Moses. So Elijah ends up on Mount Sinai, and he has a revelation of God. But here it's very different than what happened at Mount Sinai for the children of Israel. There, there's thunder and lightning and very dramatic. With Elijah, it's very different. It seems to be purposefully a counter to what happened in the book of Exodus. What happens in the book of Kings with Elijah? It says there was a great wind, but God was not in the wind. Then there was an earthquake. God was not in the earthquake. Then a fire. God was not in the fire. After all those loud natural phenomena, you have kol demama daka. We know it from the King James translation as a still small voice. But actually, the Hebrew doesn't mean that. It really means a sound of sheer stillness. So God is found in the stillness. And maybe that itself is a critique of Elijah. Don't just, rant and rave against the false gods. Have a gentler approach, maybe God is telling Elijah. But what God actually says to him is go anoint, go commission your successor. So really Elijah is fired by God, and the rabbis take that as meaning you're too harsh, you're too much of a zealot. And that's why we have the transformation of Elijah that we'll explore.
So I wanted to get at maybe blurring together or blending together that initial Elijah and the later Elijahs. I'm kind of curious what happens there, because what I love about your book is, on the one hand, it is a biography of Elijah, and it totally belongs in this series. But it's not just a biography of Elijah. It's also kind of a biography of everybody who's ever done something with Elijah. Like Elijah as the mode of Jewish creation or Jewish text making or Jewish storytelling. Like over time, we could say, certain people told stories about Elijah in the Bible, and then they did so in the Talmud, and then they did so in the medieval times, and now they're doing it today. One way they did that is they literally said Elijah was reincarnated as various people, other way around, that earlier characters like Pinchas in the Torah were in fact Elijah before Elijah came to be, and that Elijah was sort of able to be this, go-between between the divine realm and the human realm, sometimes taking various human forms. I guess I'm curious to hear from you both, what was happening there? Like, how would you describe Elijah's role as this intermediary between the divine and the human? More than that, though, I'm curious, why? Why are we doing that? And I say we on purpose because, still at the Passover Seder, we seem to want, for whatever reason, a moment in the Seder where we're visited by somebody from 2,900 years ago. Why were we continually, over and over again, looking to find Elijah anew in different eras and incarnations?
As you say, a biography of Elijah really tells you about the people who are imagining and reimagining Elijah. What you see is, what were Jews yearning for in each generation? What were they missing? What were they hoping for? And they project that onto Elijah. They recast Elijah so that Elijah will provide them with what they need. So it shows you more about what they need than it shows you about who Elijah was. Obviously, it shows the latter as well. He is a shapeshifter, right? He changes forms, and he changes forms as we progress in the story. But even in rabbinic literature, he can appear as a Roman official. He can appear as a slave. He usually appears as an old man. That's what you find in a lot of the stories, and that archetype of the old man, right? That's the archetype of wisdom. But really, he's the embodiment of the Holy Spirit. He's the embodiment of Ruach HaKodesh. Remember the wind. The wind could take him anywhere. I think Elijah learns how to navigate the wind. He's carried by the wind, but then he learns how to convey the wind, how to convey the Spirit to others. What Elijah really represents is something within us that yearns for a deeper quality of existence, something that you could say something beyond the ego. So this idea that Elijah is Pinchas. I mean, who is Pinchas? Pinchas is a relatively minor character in the Bible, but what's most striking about Pinchas is the same thing that's most striking about the biblical Elijah. He's a zealot. Pinchas appears in the book of Numbers, and the reason he's famous is that he killed an Israelite who was fornicating with a Midianite princess. So Elijah kills this couple that are.
Sorry, you said Elijah. I think you meant Pinchas, but that's
Elijah.
You're getting at where the reincarnation is going.
Exactly, yeah. So Pinchas kills this couple, and as a result, God rewards him with priesthood for him and his descendants. So that's Pinchas in the Bible. So then later you have Elijah, who's also the zealot, right? Elijah is fighting for the glory, for the honor of the Lord. So there's something similar about Pinchas and Elijah. And in later Hebrew tradition, you have the statement, Pinchas hu Eliyahu. Pinchas is Elijah. Now, I used to think that meant that both of them convey that same quality of being a zealot. Or then I thought, no, maybe it's saying that Elijah was a reincarnation of Pinchas. But it's not that. It's more than that. It's that Pinchas actually became Elijah. Pinchas lived long enough that he just changed his name and he was Elijah. Now, in biblical chronology, that's impossible because there are like 300 or 400 years between Pinchas and Eliyahu. But that became a tradition that Pinchas lived long enough that he became Elijah. I think what it shows you is that quality of zeal was the defining characteristic of both of them. But this idea of the shapeshifter is fascinating. You have a beautiful story in the Talmud about Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir rescued his sister-in-law from a Roman brothel. The sister-in-law of Rabbi Meir was condemned to slavery, and a particularly harsh kind of slavery, to be in a Roman brothel. So Rabbi Meir rescued his sister-in-law from the brothel, and as a result, the Romans were out to get Rabbi Meir. They posted his picture on the gates of Rome. They said, a reward for anyone who finds this person. So some Roman soldiers were just about to capture Rabbi Meir, and who shows up? Elijah shows up. In what form? He temporarily takes the form of a prostitute. He goes up to Rabbi Meir and embraces Rabbi Meir, and the Romans say, that can't be Rabbi Meir. He would never do something like that. So Elijah thereby saves Rabbi Meir. That's, you could say, the most dramatic example of this being a shapeshifter. But the point is that he's not limited to his biblical self, and he's not limited to any one form. Because he can take so many forms, people reimagined him according to what they needed, to what they dreamed about. So you see the Jewish psyche revealed in these various portrayals of Elijah.
I would love to understand a little better why that has happened to Elijah, that shape-shifting. Why this character? And is it as simple as, and this is something I think we didn't quite mention, that in the biblical story of Elijah, it doesn't say that he died. It says that he was carried up into heaven. And the part of me says, well, that's just a euphemism for that he died. But there are a couple of characters, Enoch is one of them in the Bible, who it says something other than they died or they were gathered to their fathers or whatever statements are usually made about somebody who dies. And is it just that like people say, well, we want to tell a set of stories and there's only a very small number of characters that are available that didn't die in the Bible, so that's kind of how it happens? And is there a reason why we don't have stories about Enoch, but we do have stories about Elijah? Was it because of Elijah's zealotry or just something else? Like, what is your sense of why this has happened to the character of Elijah?
So we have the other great story. We mentioned Mount Carmel and the revelation at Sinai. The other great dramatic moment is, of course, when Elijah ends his biblical career. So he's walking with his disciple, Elisha. So Elijah and Elisha are walking by the Jordan, and suddenly a chariot of fire appears, and carries Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind. That's all that the Bible says, right? The Bible is very often elliptical or laconic. So it says Elijah was carried up to heaven, and you're right, it doesn't say whether he died or not. It's really ambiguous in the book of Kings. It's exactly what you said. Does this mean it's a spectacular death, or does it mean he avoided death entirely? And I really wanted to know, what does the Bible mean? And I finally realized the Bible intentionally leaves it ambiguous. But there is a hint. The hint is that Elisha, his disciple, what's his reaction? Elisha tears his clothes. Now that becomes, in Jewish tradition, a sign of mourning. You have it earlier in the Bible, too, where Jacob tears his clothes because he thinks that his son Joseph has died. So it was accustomed to tear your garment over the death of a relative. So Elisha tears his clothes. What does that mean? Elisha thinks that Elijah has died. In any case, that leaves a window. A window is open. Maybe Elijah is still up there in heaven. And the other factor here is a later passage in the Bible, the prophet Malachi, right? Malachi, the last prophet in the Hebrew canon, in the biblical canon. Malachi is conveying God's words, "Behold, I am sending to you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the day of the Lord." So already in the Bible, you have the idea that Elijah is still in heaven and he's going to reappear when the final day comes. But you mentioned Enoch, right? Enoch is the only other person in the Hebrew Bible about whom you could say he didn't die. Now, the Bible doesn't say he didn't die, and the Bible doesn't say Elijah didn't die. But about Elijah, we saw it's ambiguous. What does it say about Enoch? Enoch walked with God, and he was no longer because God took him. What does that mean, God took him? Maybe that's a euphemism for he died. But that leaves an opening. No, he didn't die. He's taken up to heaven. So the tradition came to be that Enoch is an angel. You could say Elijah became an angel and Enoch became an angel. Those are the two people in the Hebrew Bible who perhaps are still living. But there's a very interesting difference. Enoch never comes back. Enoch's in heaven. I mean, why leave heaven? If you're in heaven, why leave? So Enoch stays in heaven. Elijah doesn't stay. Elijah is in heaven, but he comes down constantly to help, to advise people, to enlighten people, eventually to announce the Mashiach. So it's very telling that those are the two, and Elijah is the one who doesn't want to stay there. As to why Elijah changes, why don't we just have stories elaborating on the miracles in the book of Kings? There are a lot of miracles told. In fact, Elijah and his disciple Elisha, they are the only two people in the whole Bible who are frequently performing miracles. You have miracles with Moses, you have other miracles, but Elijah and Elisha are frequently performing miracles. So isn't that enough? Why do we have these later stories? One reason is that the rabbis were not satisfied with his character. Here was a prophet who was too harsh and too extreme. So you could explain it two ways. You could say the rabbis want to refashion Elijah, but I would see it in a different way also, that Elijah himself needs to undertake a tikkun, a mending, a correction. Elijah learns how to be compassionate over the ages. He realizes that in the Bible he was too harsh, and he changes over time as he's reimagined generation by generation.
So I am going to have a very low humility moment and give my not scholarly take on my theory that has very little evidence or basis for it other than my intuition about why Elijah has become so important. Your response can be, "Dear Lex, it's all wrong." And I look forward to that if it is the response. If it's right, great. If it's not sure, also great. You mentioned Enoch. I, for the last few years, have been very obsessive about the books of the Apocrypha, the books that did not make it into our Jewish canon of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, but have made it into various other Bibles, other versions of the Bible. And even for Jews, like at various points in history, there is evidence they mattered to Jews. There is evidence that Jews cared about some of these books in a wide variety of communities. Enoch is one of those books that I have been fascinated with. I learned the entirety of it in Chavruta with a dear friend of mine. Enoch is pre-Jewish, and I think that is important. Enoch is the 7th generation from Adam in the chronology of Genesis. It doesn't matter who Enoch is so much to what I'm about to say, but like Enoch comes a long time before Abraham comes along and is sort of marked as beginning the Jews. I think that the fact that we have a bazillion midrashes, hot takes, ideas of what Elijah is, and the fact that we don't so much with Enoch reflects what we are doing, why we are seeking to find like an antecedent in the past. Like, because we could, the basic starting point is we want to have a really ancient anchor in some of our stories. On Passover, we want to have somebody visit who is from a long time ago. At circumcisions, we want to have somebody there who represents 2,900 years ago. So we're going to mention Elijah at the circumcision. We, at Havdalah services, when we're separating Shabbat from the rest of the week, we want to remind ourselves that we're part of a really old tradition. So the obvious question is, wouldn't you want to go back as far as possible? Wouldn't you want to mention Adam? Or at the very least, a guy like Enoch, who is really, really, really old, as opposed to Elijah, who is a long time after that? My answer is no, because the specific effort that is at play here is that we're trying to shape Jewish memory. We're trying to shape Jewish storytelling. And the fact that Enoch is pre-Jewish and is an ancestor even of Noah, who then is an ancestor of the entire world, it's not a particularist story to tell a bunch of stuff about Enoch. It might be a great story. And we have, and part of why I feel like I have some evidence for this is because like there are lots of books about Enoch. Enochic literature is like a genre. We have a whole slew of stories, but the rabbis aren't really participating so much. They mention him, sure, they mention him, but he's not their fascination because he's not Jewish. And so I guess my question is like, does this point to the ways in which Elijah isn't just anchoring us to the Bible or to the ancient past? He's anchoring us specifically to a Jewish past. And that's why we can make him a reincarnation or a continuation of Pinchas, but we wouldn't go back before the generations that are Jewish. Pinchas is already after the time that sort of Israeliteness starts.
There's definitely something to that. I think the word that comes to mind as you were talking is tradition. Right? Elijah is really the guardian of tradition. That's really one of his great values. So Enoch, is too primal. Enoch or Adam is before the Torah, before tradition, before Abraham. So you're saying, as you say, it's pre-Jewish. Elijah, who could be more traditional than Elijah? And that explains also why Elijah is so important for Kabbalah. Right? What does Kabbalah mean? Kabbalah means tradition. So the Kabbalists were simultaneously creating something new and trying to bolster the tradition. So Elijah is the perfect person to enlighten the Kabbalists. Louis Ginsburg, the great Talmud scholar, he says something remarkable. He says, what Moses was to the Torah, Elijah was to the Kabbalah. And I think that's something of an exaggeration, but it shows that the Kabbalists needed someone within the tradition to ratify their radical new interpretations. And someone like Adam or Enoch is too early. As you say, it's pre-Jewish. So Elijah is the guarantor of tradition, right? That's why he shows up at every bris, at every covenant of circumcision. He also is mystical and ancient at the same time, but he's not too ancient. Okay, he's after Mount Sinai, he's after the Torah. And for the rabbis, Elijah is actually studying Torah all the time, right? What is he doing in heaven? He's not, sitting back on a cloud. He's in the heavenly academy, studying with the Kodesh Baruch Hu, studying with the Holy One, blessed be He, and the souls of the righteous. And he can move back and forth, right? He actually tells people what God is feeling in that academy. He embodies the Spirit, but he's guaranteeing the continuity of the Jewish tradition and of the Jewish family, right? Enoch doesn't really seem very familial. Enoch is up there isolated in heaven. Elijah, who was such a loner, what happens to him? He's invited into the most intimate moments of the Jewish calendar, of the Jewish family. He's there at every Seder. What could be more familial, not familiar, that too, but familial? What could be more family-oriented than a Seder? So Elijah takes on that role of family and tradition in a way that Enoch or Adam couldn't do.
Is the idea that Elijah is the herald of the Messiah, is that fundamentally and only from the book of Malachi? Or, how does that sort of grow? And I'm specifically interested in that on the level of how, you talked about Elijah being the Moses of the Kabbalah. Elijah also plays this important role in the Talmud, which is much earlier. And part of me says, hey, the rabbis were actually doing something very clever in the Talmud because they were doing all this innovation. And most famously, or at least for me, most famously, Elijah appears in the story of the oven of Achnai in the Talmud, which is this story basically about how Rabbi Joshua says, you don't even have to listen to the voice of God if God's voice comes down and tells you to do it a different way, because the Torah is not in the heavens. It says that in the Torah, and we're going to interpret that to mean that even God had only one chance to speak, and if we have a way of interpreting God's words in a way that even God doesn't agree with, it goes by us. And then somebody says, well, actually, I ran into Elijah and we had a conversation about this. And they said, well, what did he say? And he said, oh, God laughed at that point and said that, my children have defeated me and, or my children have sort of overcome me in argument, and that idea that Elijah reported that God loved this story is critical, because you could say, as any child and a parent, okay, we did this thing that was a little bit transgressive. Well, how did dad respond? And either dad said, I'm taking away the car and you're never driving again until you have your own car, or dad left, right? And it turns out that dad left. And so that plays a critical role, I think, in the rabbis being able to claim that this new Judaism is really the old Judaism, because Elijah is around and reports that God likes this. And Elijah keeps coming back and forth to kind of tell us, keep going, we like what you're doing. And also that when we don't know what to do, Elijah is going to come at some point in the future and he'll clear it up. But in the meantime, our rabbinic new form of Judaism can proceed because we might be wrong, but we don't know. So Elijah will clear it up one day. So I guess I'm curious if you see it the same way that the rabbis are using Elijah as kind of a vehicle for claiming that their innovations are actually grounded or somehow okay with God, and how did that happen with Elijah? Is it also just because he's the only guy that's around because he didn't die?
Yeah, that's fascinating too. First of all, Malachi, says Elijah will come before the day of the Lord. The rabbis really take that as meaning Elijah will herald the Mashiach, will herald the Messiah. It certainly comes from Malachi. The book of Malachi, as I said, is the last book of the Hebrew prophets. But then, of course, we have a lot of other stuff in the Bible, right? Psalms and Job and Proverbs and Chronicles and many other books. But in the Christian Bible, the Christian Old Testament ends with Malachi. So the very final lines of a Christian Old Testament are the prediction that Elijah will come before the day of the Lord. What happens when you turn the page? The next page is Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. So the Christians have it set up that Elijah will announce the Mashiach, and so he must be announcing Jesus. Now there's a problem, because in the New Testament, Elijah doesn't announce Jesus. Who announces Jesus?
John the Baptist, yeah.
John the Baptist. But Jesus actually says John the Baptist is Elijah. So even in the New Testament, Elijah is the one who's really preparing the way for the final revelation. But to get back to your point, this idea of innovation is amazing. If you have an insight, right, and we all like to have insights, and occasionally we have insights. So the question is, where does the insight come from, right? Is it just me? Am I making this up? Or have I somehow plugged into something eternal, some source of perennial wisdom? So Elijah is the way that a Jew says, it's not from me. It's from something beyond me. Elijah is the one beyond. Or you could say Elijah is really the one in between. Elijah bridges heaven and earth. He bridges ancient history and the final messianic moment. He's one author has called him the virtuoso of the in-between. So if you have an insight and you're bold enough or crazy enough to think, this isn't me, this is something beyond me that I've received, how can you possibly receive it? Eliyahu. Eliyahu is the link. So I was saying it about Kabbalah, but you're saying it's really true already in rabbinic literature. Elijah is the one who communicates between heaven and earth. And that great story about the oven of Achnai that you paraphrased, right? That finally, without the punchline, it's really not a great story. Right? What's the punchline? The punchline is after the rabbis realize that they're actually, creating Torah on their own. The important punchline is that God laughed and said, Nitzchuni banai, my children have defeated me, my children have defeated me. But how do we know that God knew that? We only know it because some rabbi ran into Eliyahu, as you said. Eliyahu tells you what God was feeling. but he also can tell you, he can inspire you to come up with some new insight into Torah or a new way to imagine Judaism. Because really, what the rabbis do and the Kabbalists do and the Hasidim do, and what you're trying to do, is to reimagine Judaism. So Elijah can play a vital role there as the one who authenticates it, who communicates it, who gives you the boldness to go out and do it.
I want to really sit with Elijah as, I don't know, like liminal, because one way we could distill where Elijah pops up is, you mentioned this, like moments where we're fearful about, like at the circumcision, we're nervous about whether the child and the mother will be okay. And so Elijah is this like protector figure. When I think about the three most prominent situations I can think of where Elijah pops up: circumcision, Passover Seder, and Havdalah.
Yeah.
So Havdalah being the ritual distinguishing between Shabbat and the rest of the week. I will tell you, for a long time, I was really confused about Havdalah. Havdalah has very little liturgy. There's 4 blessings that to me make a great deal of sense, actually. Like, I think it's a beautiful, compact ritual. It's very sensory. You've got a ritual related to fire. You've got a ritual related to smells. You've got a ritual related to taste with wine. I did that in the wrong order, by the way. But the 4th one, the final one, is the ritual that actually says, Shabbat done, new week starting. It's like very logical on this pathway from Shabbat to not Shabbat. But then there's this thing where at every Havdalah I've ever been to, as far as I can remember, even very secular ones, traditional, like everybody then sings about Elijah. Like, why? And so for a long time I was really confused by that. And I think honestly, even until I read your book, I didn't have much of an answer to that. I hadn't thought about it in a while, but I do remember growing up just like, why? Like, I understood that I wasn't deeply Jewishly literate, but the 4 blessings, I was like, oh, I get it. This I don't. But now I'm thinking, maybe the essence of when Elijah pops up isn't moments where we're fearful or looking for protection. Not that that's like false, but it seems like there's this liminal piece where we're on the precipice between X and Y. In the case of Havdalah, X and Y is Shabbat and not Shabbat. In the case of the Passover Seder, it's trickier, so I'm going to leave that for the side. But in the case of circumcision, it's like entering the world, not alive and alive. This is the moment that marks somebody entering. And like, I understand it's 8 days after birth, but like Jewishly, you're not waiting 8 days because like you're waiting, like it's just established like, this child will actually be alive. And so we don't want to do it on day 1 because then we might do a lot of these rituals and have the tragedy of it not being viable. The Passover Seder, I also think, is kind of liminal. Now, I think it's the liminality between us today and the Jewish past or something like that. But basically, I think Eliyahu has this fascinating role where he is constantly popping up when you're transgressing, I'm going to say like the binary between like the divine and humans. Transgressing a binary between Shabbat and the rest of the week. Transgressing a binary between alive and not yet alive with circumcision. I'm curious, like, is that something that seems right for describing when Eliyahu pops up? And once again, like, what might we actually learn from that need? Why in moments of liminal space, why in moments of transgressing otherwise hard and fast binaries or seemingly hard and fast binaries do we look to this guy Elijah?
Very much so. Elijah is the virtuoso of the in-between. And you mentioned, this element of fear, right? Sometimes we think of Elijah in fear, but fear is connected with that, right? As you're making a transition, it's the unknown, it's facing the unknown, it's leaving one state maybe with which you're familiar and trying something new or uncertain. So it's natural to be anxious, to be fearful. And Elijah eases that transition because he's the one who's made such transitions, right? He's crossed from life to death and then back from, ancient history to modern times. It's interesting with Elijah living forever in the Bible, right? It's not clear that he lives forever in the book of Kings, but he brings back the dead to life, right? He revives that child who has died, the child of the widow of Sarepta, the widow of Zarephath. Elijah brings him back to life. So Elijah has conquered death So he's characterized by mastering the in-between. So those three moments are definitely so. Passover is, as you say, ancient time and modern time, but it's also slavery to liberation. So that transition from slavery to liberation, we're supposed to reenact that, right? The person has to see himself as if we are now leaving Egypt. So that transition from being slaves to being free, Elijah helps us make that transition. And the Brit, death and life, and Havdalah. I'd like to say something about Havdalah, which is fascinating. As you say, it becomes clear why Elijah shows up at Passover, because that's a time of redemption. And the Brit is because he's safeguarding the covenant of circumcision. But why Havdalah? You conclude Shabbat, you've made the transition. Why specifically Havdalah? Well, there's a teaching in the Talmud. We don't know exactly when the Messiah is going to come, but we know when he's not going to come. The Messiah is not going to come on Friday. Why? Because people are too busy preparing for Shabbat. Why stop your Shabbos preparation just to go out to greet the Messiah? This is so characteristic of Rabbinic Judaism, right? Don't dream about the Messiah. Do what needs to be done right now. So the Talmud actually says the Messiah is not going to come on Friday. Okay, if the Messiah is not going to come on Friday, maybe the Messiah could come on Shabbat. So then Eliyahu would come on Friday, the Messiah would come on Shabbat, but the Messiah is not going to come on Shabbat. But maybe the Messiah could come on right when Shabbat ends. If the Messiah could come when Shabbat ends, then Eliyahu would come when? On Shabbat. Because according to the Talmud, Elijah will come one day before the Mashiach. So maybe after all, Shabbat is a taste of the world to come. It's a taste of the Messiah. So it would make sense. We finish Shabbat, Mashiach would come. But for the Mashiach to come on Saturday night, Elijah would have to come on Shabbat. What's the problem? Elijah can't travel on Shabbat. Elijah follows the halacha. Elijah is the embodiment of tradition. So wait a minute, maybe that limitation about traveling on Shabbat doesn't apply if you're flying. You're not allowed to walk more than 2,000 cubits. 2,000 cubits is about half a mile. You're not allowed to walk more than half a mile. It's a lot more than half a mile from heaven to Jerusalem. But if Elijah is flying, maybe there's not that restriction. And there's actually a discussion in the Talmud. Maybe Elijah can fly, but it's not decided whether he can or can't. We take the safe way out. We say, okay, Elijah can't come on Shabbat. So Havdalah, finally Shabbat is over. We say, okay, no more excuses. We want you to come, Eliyahu. That's why we sing to Eliyahu. That's one explanation of why we sing to Eliyahu. It's now time for the redemption. But the important point is that he is the one who himself embodies that transition from so many states to their opposite. And he communicates from heaven to earth, and he helps us make those transitions in the moments that are anxiety provoking.
So this is really, really cool. And I just have one final question. And for listeners, they're not going to be super surprised. I'm constantly thinking about names, and Elijah's name is really interesting. I think part of the answer to why is there so much stuff about Elijah post-Bible and otherwise, all the answers we've all come up with so far are still on the table. But the guy's name is Eliyahu, which is two names of God in one name. It's like God squared in a name. And what I mean by that, even thinking of the Shema prayer. The Shema prayer, we typically say it, Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. God is our God, God is one. But we're using code language there. I'm going to use Yahoo for what we say Adonai, because Yahoo would be one possibility for how you pronounce that four-letter name of God. This is not a shout out to the corporation Yahoo or the website. I don't think great things about that website. But Yahu Eloheinu, Yahu Echad. It's a prayer that says two different names for God that are common in Jewish tradition are intertwined and are one. And both of those names are present in the name Eliyahu, or partially present in the name Eliyahu. You've got El, which is part of Elohim, and you've got Yahu, which is part of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. And so that really jumps out to me as okay, if we're going to have a tradition that creates cool fan fiction about the Bible, which we do, you're probably going to notice the guy whose name is God and try to come up with something. So I wanted to say that, but I also wanted to say that there's a way in which I think Elijah is God light, diet God. He's a form of personified God that humans can actually strive to, because we have a problem theologically in Judaism compared to Christianity. which is that Christianity actually has a personage, a person, Jesus, that you can wear a bracelet that says, what would Jesus do? And you can try to live your life and follow Jesus. And that's an easy framework to have in your life. Jewishly, because God is not a person in that same sense, although, there are different notions of what God is, but like in the ones that have won historically, we don't have a super personified God. So like, what would God do is a harder thing to operate in your life. But Elijah, in a lot of these rabbinic texts you cite, becomes this exemplar, this aspirational idea of what human beings might be. He becomes like a what would Jesus do for Jews. So I guess I'm curious to close our episode. This is partially an excuse to allow you to talk about parts of your book where you highlight other religious traditions that aren't just Jews, because Jesus, of course, is a figure in Christianity. But like, is Elijah, as we close this episode, human? Is Elijah some kind of divine at this point? Or is the point maybe that he fuses the two, bends the two, and allows for humans to strive towards something divine?
Yeah. First of all, his name is so fascinating. You have many biblical characters who have one divine element in their name. But as you say, Elijah is really not totally unique, but he's special in that you could say he's suffused by God, right? His whole name means my God is Yahoo. He's permeated by God. Maybe he's obsessed by God. So I think he's about as close as you can come in Judaism to a divinized human. I mean, you have statements about Moses in rabbinic literature and much more so in Kabbalah, where Moses was married to God. And I think, Christianity is very much in the background here. Jews were hesitant to say something that sounded like, describing a biblical hero as a Jesus figure. But listen to this. This is what one Kabbalist says about Elijah. This is Moses Cordovero, who lived with Isaac Luria in Sfat in the 16th century. He says, Elijah never appears in the world without the mystery of divinity revealing itself through him. The closest that divinity can possibly come to humanity is the mystery of Elijah. So it seems that Elijah is the one who tasted divine nature, and then he becomes the one who conveys that possibility to spiritual seekers. It's interesting that his greatest moment of triumph on Mount Carmel, when he defeats the prophets of Baal, what happens? When he wins the contest, when he brings down fire from heaven, all of the Israelites there, they shout out, Adonai hu ha-Elohim. Yahweh is God, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh is God. And what happens to that line? That line enters the Jewish liturgy at the conclusion of Yom Kippur, right? One of the most dramatic moments in the whole Jewish cycle, the Ne'ilah, the closing of the gates, where the cantor says 7 times, and the congregation responds 7 times with that line. On Mount Carmel, it was recited twice. On Yom Kippur, it's 7 times, but it's obviously from Elijah's moment. So his championing of God becomes central in Jewish liturgy, but his attainment of that semi-divine status, you could say not in the Bible, but in the later traditions we've been exploring, that is as close as Judaism comes to that embodiment of the Holy Spirit. Then in Kabbalah, you really have discussion. How can you attain a revelation of Elijah? It wasn't just for the great mystics. If you follow a certain spiritual path that I describe in the book, that's described by Chaim Vital, another great Kabbalist in Sfat, he actually spells out what should you do in order to attain a revelation of Elijah. What I'm saying is that it becomes not just one person who did it in the past, but how can you encounter Elijah? And then really, how can you become Elijah? How can you channel your passion into helping to redeem the world? Because one thing we haven't touched on at all that's important is Elijah's commitment to social justice. He's not just a spiritual hero. He confronts King Ahab when King Ahab expropriates land from someone. He stands up for the poor. He stands up for, you could say, for a kind of democratic right. And he puts limits on authoritarian power. That's part of his greatness, too.
What an incredible, perfect note to end on. Thank you so much, Daniel Matt, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Great. Good to explore with you.
And thank you so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We want to remind you that right now, right this second, you can head to judaismunbound.com/classes and register for our upcoming 3-week mini courses. Do not pass go. Proceed directly to judaismunbound.com/classes. Check out our different mini course options that begin just after Passover ends, not right after Passover starts, right after it ends. But register right now. You don't want to wait. You can find out more info again at judaismunbound.com/classes. And we want to close out this conversation in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us. And there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to any of our social media handles. That's Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, you can head to our website, judaismunbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode, information about the Onion Yeshiva, and lots more. And of course, you can email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. The last request we like to make is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you're able to send our way, which you can do via judaismunbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.